I wonder how you felt when you heard the words of Genesis 1 being read aloud this morning. It's a really familiar passage. It's one that in a lot of children's books, it's one that if you grew up in church, you would have grown up hearing. And I don't know about you, but it's really easy when I start to hear Genesis 1 to kind of tune out a little bit. And it's like, in the beginning, and God said, and it was good, and there was light, and there was some fish. At the end, and God saw all that he made, and he rested, whatever that means. And it's quite easy to take this story for granted, because it's the first story on the first page of the Bible. But what I hope to begin to show you this morning is that this is a beautiful piece of Hebrew meditation literature that contains like wondrous mysteries about God. And it's such a rich passage that I would argue that almost every major theme in the Bible has its origin somewhere in Genesis 1. And if it's not in Genesis 1, it's probably in Genesis 2 or 3. If you want to understand the nature of God, the nature of humans, the nature of creation, if you want to understand relationships, if you want to understand good versus evil, light versus dark, if you want to understand why the world is so bad and why humans can be so good and so bad at the same time, if you want to understand what grace is, if you want to understand what holiness is, the first and only use of the word holy in Genesis is used in the creation narrative on day 7. If you want to understand food laws, if you want to understand all of these things, Genesis is where the answers begin. And so this is not a passage to read quickly and move past. It's one to dwell in and to meditate on and to notice interesting things about. It's designed to be memorable. There's a lot of repetition. It's designed to be meditated on. So you can imagine it was really easy to prepare a 20-minute message based on Genesis 1. But we're looking at, the reason we're looking at this passage today is because we're in a series looking at the Creed, which was a statement of belief, one of the statements of belief written by the early church. And the sentence that we're looking at today, specifically from that creed, is believing in God, the maker of heaven and earth. But if you look in the rest of that creed, you'll find that references to God being a maker are not just found at the beginning with God the Almighty, the Father, but they're also found in reference to the Son, where it says, by whom and for whom all things were made, and to the Spirit, the giver of life. So we're just going to start by noticing that each member of the Trinity is in the first 2 verses of Genesis 1, because they're there. In the beginning, God. That's the Almighty. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. There was nothing. It's really hard to imagine nothing. And it's even harder to imagine a time before time when there is no space and no up and down and left and right and upside down and right way round. But somehow there was God, and he was there in the beginning. And the first thing that we see him do is create. But he's not alone, if that makes sense. Verse 2, darkness was over the surface of the deep. We'll get to that in a second. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. This is a word that means like breath or wind. It's the same spirit or wind that animates the bones when Ezekiel prophesies to the dry bones in the valley. And it's the same breath that breathes on the church when they hear the sound of a mighty wind and the flames come on them at Pentecost. Then verse 3, and God said. What language did he speak? If you were somehow there in the time before time, and there was nothing, and you heard the Almighty God open his mouth and say, let there be light, what would you have heard? In the Chronicles of Narnia and in the Silmarillion, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis imagine God creating with a melody. They imagine it as a song. But in Scripture, and actually in John, we find the answer where there's a parallel creation story, and it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we later find the Word is Jesus. When God speaks and expresses, that is who Jesus is. Jesus is the expression of God, and he is God, and he is the one that he is how creation was made, and he is what it was made for. Just in the first 3 verses of Genesis, we begin to see the whole Trinity. And this gets picked up in the New Testament in John, in Colossians, where Jesus is referred to as the firstborn over creation. So not of creation, because he wasn't created. Firstborn over, as in the inheritor, as in the one who gets the wealth of creation. When I was a baby, so I'm told, I wasn't told that I was a baby, but I'm told that when I was a baby, I got given a children's Bible, and it had a creation narrative in it. And it said something like, in the beginning, God was all alone, and he wanted someone to love, and so he made the world. And my parents promptly tore the book in half and chucked it in the bin. God didn't make because he was lonely. He didn't make the world because he needed someone to love. He was love already, right? And that's a really interesting challenge to religions that have one God but not a Trinity, because it's like, well, how is your God loving if he's alone? Does that mean he needs people in order to be love? It's like just an interesting thought. God was love. So this is the God we worship. He is love. The God who is a relationship, the God who makes the world, and he makes it together with himself as one being with one purpose and one drive, but 3 members. I'm not going to get into the depths of the Trinity right now, but that's just a taster of the riches of Genesis 1 and the rest of the Bible. So that's kind of point 1. The whole of God is involved in creating. Secondly, this is really interesting, and I loved learning about this, but did you know there are 2 types of water in Genesis 1, verse 2? Your translation might have it written as, now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, or abyss. And the word there in Hebrew is tehom, and it kind of means chaotic, watery nothingness. And in order to understand it, I want you to imagine with me that you were an ancient Hebrew, or an ancient Egyptian, or an ancient Babylonian, because they had quite a similar philosophy about this kind of water. I want you to imagine that you go for a swim in the sea, and it's salty, and you don't like drinking it, and it's wavy, and you're getting pushed side to side, and as you swim, there's a point where you can't touch the bottom anymore. And the further you go out, no matter how good you are at swimming or how good you are at holding your breath, you can't reach the bottom. You can't touch it. You can't see it. There's no submarines. There's no sonar. There's nothing that would tell you that the ocean has a floor. And so in ancient Near Eastern philosophy, like salty seawater was thought of as a bottomless abyss. That's kind of terrifying, because who knows what could be there. And it became understood as something that was totally opposite to human life, right? Because you can't survive on salty water. You can't survive when there are waves crashing around. There's no land for you to stand on. There's no food for you to eat. There's no way for humans to be there, let alone for humans to have meaningful relationships or purpose or drive or anything. It just, this chaotic, abysmal waters, which were symbolized by the sea, became a way for people to understand like chaotic nothingness that was just void of meaning and purpose. It's like really delightful, isn't it? And this reoccurs in the Bible. Whoops. And so it says, like in Psalm 71, the psalmist says, "You'll revive me, you'll bring me up from the abyss, from the depths." Because people began to notice, hey, have you seen that sometimes like water comes up from the ground? like in a spring or something, that must mean that there's like water underneath all the land. And when you're buried and when you're dead, you end up going down into this abyss. That's kind of how they thought of the world. When the flood comes in Noah's time to destroy the world, it's out of the depths that the waters come. And then the sea began to become a symbol to that which stood in opposition to the people of God. So when the slaves were escaping Egypt in Exodus, what stands between them and their freedom? The sea, and it gets parted. In Revelation, when all things are made perfect, what's missing from creation? The sea. There's no more sea. There's nothing that stands in opposition to human life and flourishing and meaning. So we read, now darkness was over the surface of the abyss. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. What are these waters? This is a different word for water, mayim. The first one was to home. And this is water that's somehow been brought under control, like a stream or a well. When the streams come up from the deep, but are made into streams in Genesis 2 to water the Garden of Eden, this is the water that's there. When there's water that people are drawing from a well to drink, this is that water. Darkness is over the abyss, but God's Spirit is over the waters. And this sets up the story for like the whole of the rest of the Bible, where constantly humans are creating situations that mirror this darkness, and it's chaotic and it's meaningless and there's no structure, but God's Spirit comes over it and it brings life, like the waters that bring life. Where did the people of God come from? Where did the Israelites come from before they were called Israelites? They're Babylonians, right? Because God saves Noah, and then the nation of Babylon comes up, and then out of Babylon, there's darkness over Babylon. It's an evil, oppressive empire, and darkness is over the face of it. But the Spirit of God comes, and he picks out a family, Abraham, and he begins to bring structure and order and a way for life. And darkness is over the people of God when they're in slavery in Egypt, but the Spirit of God is there, and he redeems them from slavery and brings them out through the waters and begins to establish them as a nation that's going to model what it means to be a human who flourishes and who knows how to worship God. And darkness was over the face of the earth when the Roman Empire was there. And, they're pretty cool. They built some aqueducts. They had underfloor heating. But they were pretty brutal. They were brutal. But the Spirit of God was over Mary, and she conceived and gave birth to a son, and he was going to be the way to life. And darkness was over Jesus' body as it hung, beaten and bruised and bleeding and pierced and dying. And literal darkness fell, but the Spirit of God was over it. And the cross became a symbol of life. And darkness was over the tomb when Jesus lay in there, and they closed the door, and there's no light. And it seems like death is won, but the Spirit of God is there, and 3 days later he raises from the dead, and now we get to participate in his life. And for you, darkness was over you. If there was a point in your life when you weren't a Christian, you were dead to sin, and darkness was over you. But the Spirit of God came, and he redeemed you, and he set you free, and he has made you a new creation with a new destination, a new purpose to bring life again into this world. This is the God that we worship, the God who is able to turn even the most chaotic, abysmal situations into ones that bring life. And I think this is what Paul is thinking of when he writes in 2 Corinthians, for God who said, let light shine out of darkness, has made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. And then later, we're hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We may look at the world and just see the abyss. You turn on the news. Even within yourself, or within your family, or within your community, or within the world, we can see the abyss. where people aren't following God's law of love and they're disobedient. But don't forget that the Spirit of God is not left. He's here and he's alive and he's active and he's moving and he can bring life. Don't be dismayed. Don't be perplexed. You're not abandoned. The Spirit of God is still living and active and he's inside you if you are a Christian. So, God creates the world out of love. All of God creates the world. Darkness is over the abyss, but the Spirit is over the waters. And the third thing to dwell on is this. It's that God makes makers. If you notice, when people are made, when all animals are made, they're given the command to fill the earth and to multiply. But people specifically are told to subdue the earth. So that's an interesting parallel, isn't it? That God somehow contains the darkness and pushes it to one side and says, let there be light. And he does all of this work like a master craftsman, creating the whole universe, which is spectacularly beautiful and complicated. And then he says to humans, and now I want you to have a creative role in my creation. You need to fill the earth and you need to subdue it. And you have a responsibility in order to bring creation into line. I don't know if you've ever tried doing something with the help of a child. When they're little and they're really keen to be involved. I've done this trying to build Lego with a child or doing baking with a child. And you're I can read the rules. I know the instructions. I know how much flour we need. I know what order we need to do it in. But this child really wants to help you. And you let them because it's a delight, but it's complete chaos. And it's messy and it takes longer than it should. And you might get frustrated because you're thank you for helping, but this is also not helping that much. God created the world and he did this cosmic work of subduing. And then he says to us, his children, I want you to help me. And it's complicated and it's messy and it takes time, but it brings somehow delight to the heart of God when we join in. And so we have a responsibility to step up. And part of bearing the image of God is to be a maker. And that could be a literal artist. But how can we be people who bring order into chaos and bring light into darkness? And the more we understand how powerful and full of life God is, the more remarkable it is that he would want us to be involved. As I was preparing for this, I thought I should just learn some astonishing things about creation. Because if God's the one who made it, and he made something so wonderful, there are things in the world that we're only just beginning to understand, and yet God made it when it didn't exist. Try and think of a smell that you haven't ever smelt, or a texture that you've never touched, or a color that you've never seen. We can't do it. All of our creativity is within the bounds of something we've already experienced, but God created from nothing. What kind of being can do that? I was chatting to some smart people this week, and they told me that, this makes no sense to me at all, but electrons have to circle around twice to get back to the same place. I don't really know what that means, but it's amazing. Again, another thing I don't quite understand, but it sounds really cool. For every 10 billion and 1 particles of matter, of stuff, there's 10 billion particles of antimatter, stuff that's cancelling out the stuff. And because they're outnumbered by 1, that's why there's something rather than nothing, why the universe doesn't just implode on itself. We live in a galaxy that has got hundreds of millions of stars in it, and yet there are more trees on our planet than stars in our galaxy. Do you know there's 3 million trees on our planet? It's 400 per person, 422 per person. And each one of those trees has got a complex series of biochemical reactions to make sure that it's alive. And it's it's a seed, and it goes in the ground, and it gets water and dirt and light, and then it becomes something, because that's how it's made, and God made it. He invented that. And that's not even getting onto like humans. And he didn't just make technical things that work. He made beautiful things that bring us delight and joy. He could have made a black and white world, but he made it in color, you know? Like, that's wonderful. And this is the God that we worship, and the God that we're called somehow to collaborate with in building a new creation. I want to end by reading the lyrics of a song. And as I read them, I just want you to just meditate on like the wonders of God. That the same God who holds the mountains in his hand, like knows you personally and wants to be involved in your life and wants you to be involved in his life. It's maybe even more remarkable. Who is God that he would take our frame, the artisan inside the paint, or breathe the very air his breath sustains, the architect inside the plan? The one who had no start and knows no end became confined in time and tense. The everlasting God, the great I am, in the mercy of a mother's hands. The one who holds the stars in the creases of his hands is the one who holds my heart like a mother once held him. The one who knows what lies where space has run its course, embraced a baby's mind, and now I can know my God. The monarch of the stars and the king above all kings, the ruler of my heart and the savior for my sins, the one who sees what lies in each and every soul, embraced our finite eyes, and now we can see our God. The holy word of God, defined by name, the author climbed inside the page. God embraced our frame when he graced the world he made. All hail the divine in a manger, love embraced our fate when the playwright took the stage.